I'm Randy Nessie. I'm delighted to be with you. This is my very first week at ASU. As you all know, ASU has made a major commitment to growing the field of evolutionary medicine. It very clearly, in just a moment, has established itself as the world center for work in this area. I'd like to say a bit more about the center in a few minutes, but first let me introduce your Vice Provost, Patrick Kenny, who will give a few welcoming words and give you a sense for where this new center fits into the ASU universe. Please.
Thanks, Randy. Very much appreciate being here and being invited to be here. It's a very exciting time for ASU, first of all, in its ability to recruit Randy here from the University of Michigan, but also to be able to provide resources for him and his vision to work and set up something that is nowhere else in the world right now. So it is fundamentally new, and those kinds of ideas are something that President Crow is always looking for. He's always trying to move things forward in areas that are distinct to the academic world. And so when this idea came forward, there were a number of people got on board very quickly. This whole idea, and I was trying to read a little bit over the weekend about it, this notion of evolutionary biology as a basic science for medicine, which in itself is a new concept. We all spend time at the doctors, obviously, and the idea that the long-term vision and picture that somehow that they will be better trained and more thoughtful and have a basic knowledge about some of the processes that went into anatomy and physiology is a very exciting thing for all of us, especially as I get older, obviously. We also know that at the university there's a huge amount of energy through Professor Kumar's center that's already focused broadly on these topics. This is something else the president likes to do. He likes to germinate things that are running parallel to one another, that can interact with one another, that can create a lot of synergy, and so we're very excited about that. Of course, we're always ready to help Professor Kumar continue in his work. We also know the center probably, almost certainly will bring a lot of interactions with the Mayo Clinic, something else ASU's been working very hard to do, and we're looking for interactions across all kinds of domains of the Mayo Clinic, and so that is something else. I got to talk with Randy a little bit last week, and I talked to him when he visited, and I asked him for some examples because as a political scientist, I was trying my best to get my head around this, and he readily gave me some examples of what the center might do, what it could do. It's just fascinating stuff to think about and look at. He gave me a very readable article that I'd spent some time with over the weekend. So it's all very exciting. I do have to tell you a slight personal story. So my first introduction to science is through my father, who was a high school science teacher from 1950 to 1997, 47 years. And he coached along with that the entire time, baseball. And when he began teaching in the 1950s, he was in a small Catholic school, and he was the science department. So he taught biology, physics, and chemistry. And then in the 60s, because he had too many children, and we seemed hungry and needed things, he switched to a big public school, and there they had a number of science teachers. So he was able to teach anatomy and physiology, which were really his favorites, and that's what he taught most about. And when I talked to him in later years about that, he always talked about teaching anatomy and physiology and how students could come alive with that kind of idea, and what you're trying to do here to help us explain how those systems work is phenomenal. But my favorite story about this is he, as a freshman, was at the University of Iowa in a science class, and then he is drafted into World War II, where he's a tail gunner in a B-24 bomber in the Pacific. And he took a book, and I was wondering if any of you know it. He checked it out of the Iowa Library, called The Human Body by Logan Clendenin. I looked it up. You can still buy it for $2. He took it with him, and a bombing mission over Formosa, which is now Taiwan. He set it down on the side as he went back into his turret in the back, and the side of the plane was hit with flak, and the book fell out over Formosa. So when he reported back to Iowa, he was charged for losing the book over the Pacific, which they then waived, as they were doing for all the GIs at the time, as he was back there on the GI Bill. But that's my going and watching seeing him teach in later years, but also hearing him talk about sciences was always a phenomenal thing. And one of my brothers is a neuroscientist. And I have a son who's in a chemistry PhD program at Stanford. So there's some science running around the families. He would be stunned that I'm here introducing a center like this, I think. But he'd also be very happy to hear the kind of work that you guys are doing, and someone like me could read about it over the weekend and come to grasp, at least broadly, with the concept. So the university stands behind this project. The College of Liberal Arts and Sciences is very, very proud to have it in the college, and I look forward to seeing great things come out of it. And I know you had an exciting day and an important couple days, so best of luck, and enjoy the meetings. And if you're visiting, this is a wonderful time to be here. It's about as good as it gets, actually. So just enjoy a couple days, and I'm actually scheduled the rest of the afternoon, so I can't stay, but I did want to come by and say hello. So best of luck and good luck.
I'm really loving the interdisciplinary nature of this university. Pat and I began to have a conversation before about social science and how that fits in here, since I'm a veteran of the Institute for Social Research at the University of Michigan, and you and I will have more conversations later about science in addition to developing big programs. Thanks so much for joining us. I'm going to give you the 4-minute introduction to the center and not to take too much time from our speakers, but I did want to give a sense for those of you who haven't been in on it about what the center is all about and how this field came about. It begins with simple, plain old, unavoidable scientific curiosity. As an undergraduate, I was trying to figure out, why is there aging, given that there are lots of genetic variations that influence the rate of aging? Why on earth didn't natural selection just give us the ones that made us live a long time instead of the rest? I went to the University of Michigan Medical School, where I memorized all the things they told me to in medical school, but a little bit of curiosity persisted through the end of that, and I started hanging out with biologists in the museum, not really knowing at the time that I was in presence of some of the greatest minds of the 20th century. Dick Alexander was the nucleus who brought people in there. Bill Hamilton was there. A fellow named George Williams was also interested in aging. And I told him my theories about aging, not knowing that he had already revolutionized a whole area of biology. And he was really, really polite. He said he'd like to talk about it more. Another colleague, Bobby Lowe, just started laughing at me when I told her my group selection theory about aging. And it was one of the best things that ever happened to me, to have a colleague take this seriously and say, why don't you educate yourself, doctor? This led to me working with George Williams. And the core of our advance, I think, that a lot of people have gotten interested in, is asking a new question. That is, why are aspects of the body designed in ways that make them vulnerable to disease? Why do we have the appendix and wisdom teeth and a narrow birth canal and narrow coronary arteries and all the rest? Turns out that's engaged a lot of people in a lot of interesting science. It's a very difficult area of science because it's really hard to test these hypotheses. But it's engaged a lot of people and grown into a field many people would call evolutionary medicine. It's also become quite clear to me since then, though, that that's a very small part of what I think evolutionary medicine should be. It should be applying the basic science of evolutionary biology to understand disease and advance public health in all ways, far beyond these questions that George Williams and I were interested in. So there are now 2 textbooks for the field, 2 journals for the field, lots of blogs, courses in many universities, including here. And the field is just poised to enter a phase of exponential growth, and the investment by ASU is going to make this field flower enormously in just the next few years. We're right on the cusp, and I feel a great sense of responsibility, actually, as a new professor here at ASU, to make this all happen right. I've already engaged help from a lot of people, some of you who are here, on a steering committee to try to figure out what strategies, what people we can bring in to make this happen the best. And as a part of that, I've invited in 4 colleagues that I know well to give talks. On Friday, Bill Aird from Harvard gave a talk. Today we have 2 talks, one by Mark Flinn and the other by, Mark Flinn is giving a talk, and Andrew Reed is giving a talk, and then Bernie Crespi tomorrow is giving a talk in ISTB. So all of these, I think, will be very engaging. They'll be available on the web, and they're available streaming if you can't get them otherwise. I think at this point I'm going to go right ahead and introduce my friend and colleague, Mark Flinn. Mark I got to know when he was in the Society of Fellows at the University of Michigan during that vibrant time when we had Bill Hamilton, George Williams, and Martin Daly, and Bill Irons, and all these greats talking in informal ways all the time throughout the night and the weekend about science. It's the kind of atmosphere that I'd like to create for our center here, to the extent that that's possible. And it's going to depend on bringing in lots of people from ASU together with new recruits to create an intellectual ferment that I think is going to engage us all. Mark was here as he went from the University of Michigan to the University of Missouri, where he's continued his career in a stable way. He's now chairman of the anthropology department there. He's done research in Dominica in the Caribbean for 25 years, I think, at least. He's shy about telling you that he has 32,000 samples stored in his database, but he's done very wonderful science with that, which has been recognized. He's a fellow of the AAAS. He's the incoming president of the Human Behavior and Evolution Society. He's been honored by many other organizations. I won't take any more of his time. I'll turn it over to him. Mark, welcome.
Thank you, Randy. Thank you all for being here. It is a wonderful honor. It's a very exciting time, I think, for ASU. A lot of innovation is happening, and you guys you're really getting an amazing reputation globally. Today I'd like to talk about something that I think is at the core of evolutionary medicine. Why do we get sick? Why do we get sick? And when I ask the folks in the community that I've been working in over the past 25, 26 years, why their kids get sick, why they get sick, one of the most common responses has to do with stress. Something in their environments caused them to worry or be upset. And that's globally very common. I'd say it's a universal that we humans tend to view important connections between our social environments and our health. And it presents a bit of a conundrum. You know, for me, looking at this from an evolutionary perspective, it begs the question, why would natural selection have favored linkages between how we respond to our social environments in ways that result in us getting sick? So how could natural selection have favored those kinds of linkages? I'm going to argue that a key component of this relationship between stress and health involves social support, in particular security in the family, and that we can sort of conceptualize social stress and its effects on health as something that is a very valuable resource, almost like an insurance policy. And if you've got this support from individuals in your family and your community, it reduces the need for costly preparations and vigilance. So there are going to be trade-offs between worrying about how to deal with all the different kinds of things that could affect you negatively. And the more social support you've got, the less you have to worry about those kinds of things. So there are going to be trade-offs between those. I approach this question as from a widespread evolutionary approach, one that I think John Alcock here was very influential in spreading, particularly in the behavioral sciences. Nico Tinbergen's 4 different types of explanation and their integration. So when we think about a phenomenon such as stress response and how evolution might have produced such a thing, there are classically 4 different areas that people investigate: proximate mechanisms, including hormonal systems, neurobiology, those kinds of things. The phylogeny of a particular species system, ontogeny, so how these things are influenced by environments during development, and then the evolutionary function. How does natural selection, how did it act on all of these characteristics? And academia, science in general, tended to look at these things in a somewhat disparate way, and the genius of Tinbergen was to suggest that they are all extremely important, but they also need to be integrated with each other. And I think evolutionary medicine is a great example of that synergy, where you have people working on mechanisms, physiology, genetics, and so forth, but looking at it in an evolutionary context to think about how such systems might have evolved, how they develop, how the different phylogenetic histories of different species, including ourselves as humans, are relevant to understanding how all those things work together. I'm going to, in my talk, spend a fair bit of time initially going over some theoretical concepts, really almost a primer in anthropology. So I want to talk about how humans evolved and why I think that's important, why that's important for evolutionary medicine. We aren't Drosophila. There are some really special, unique aspects of our species, and I think if we're going to do evolutionary medicine properly, we really need to think about those special aspects of our species. And one of them is that we have these enormous brains. They're 3 times bigger than our closest relatives. They're very costly. Brains are expensive. For an infant, it's using up more than half of their metabolic resources. So there must be an extremely good reason for having this very large, costly brain. It evolved very quickly. Our hominin relatives, the Australopithecines, 2.5 million years ago, have brains only slightly larger than the other apes. So the big changes that happened occurred pretty recently, a really blink of the eye in evolutionary time, 2 million years. It's about 100,000 neurons per generation, if you want to think about it that way. That's a really rapid transition. And it's not just a bigger brain, it's a brain with all kinds of interesting specialties. And these are primarily things that facilitate our social relationships. Empathy, mental time travel in social scenario building, a bunch of different social competencies, special communication abilities. I can sit here, vibrate airwaves, and move information from my mind to yours in some very complicated and novel ways. These are very special human attributes, and we want to be thinking about what the evolutionary context was that would have favored such unusual abilities. I like mangoes. My field site, I've got a lot of mango trees, got lots of fun stories to say about mangoes, but I use this here as a prop. When I look at a mango and you think about this big brain, it doesn't take a big brain to hunt down the wily mango. It really doesn't. It's a pretty simple process. On the other hand, if you think about the complexity of our social relationships, there's an awful lot of payoff to extensive information processing to be able to be successful in that domain. Yes, we all have to eat, but as humans, often our abilities to eat are influenced primarily by our social relationships. We get food from others, we share with others. The constraints on Darwin's traditional hostile forces of nature often involve our relationships with other humans. So in addition to our brains and our mental abilities being rather special and unique, we've also got some interesting aspects of our life histories. As infants, we're pretty helpless. We're little spuds and slugs. But they are, in the words of Alison Gopnik, the greatest learning machines in the universe. They are very mentally precocial. particularly in regards to learning language. So yeah, you think about the task of an infant being born into this world and picking up a language. That's an extraordinary thing to do. We have a very extended childhood. I have 3 sons. I'm still reminded of this daily, that their childhood is extended. One of them is going to the University of Washington, and that's still an extended childhood. We also have other interesting aspects of our life history, including a post-reproductive period, menopause, which on the face of it sort of seems to fly in the face of natural selection ruthlessly driving us to reproduction. We humans reproduce in complex ways, involving a lot of parental care and grandparental care. And arguably menopause at least facilitates that in special ways in humans. So we have an awful lot going on in terms of getting information and other types of care from our close relatives. The family is, I would like to argue, one of the most important human adaptations. It's really unusual and remarkable. We have extensive parental care involving both males and females. And this in the context of complex, large social groups, which normally it's pretty difficult to get that kind of a family relationship in large groups. And this other series of adaptations that we humans have, all of which seem really focused on providing an environment for the developing child which allows them to acquire information so that eventually they will be socially successful. So by way of sort of hopefully framing for you an anthropological and evolutionary anthropological perspective on what's special and unusual about our species, I'm going to now turn to some more detailed areas. These are some of my favorite chemicals. I think they're probably yours too if you're not consciously aware of that. They give you the joys of walking outside on a spectacular January day here in Tempe. I guess they also are the ones that drive you to come inside to a talk like this, and hopefully your experience here will provoke some of the more positive aspects of what these chemicals do to you. I see them not just as the ups and downs thrills in my daily life, but they're also really valuable as clues about our evolutionary history. So the design of our hormonal systems gives us some insight into what the selective pressures were in our species, particularly when we look at things like, for example, the human family and the kinds of social relationships that are involved with that. So here, for example, I've got a picture of my youngest son when he was still very cute. And by looking at him, my hormone levels change. So my the affiliative neuropeptides, oxytocin and AVP, are rising up a little bit. If I were a chimpanzee male looking at a picture of a cute little dependent chimpanzee offspring, I would not have this kind of change. So this is an evolved difference between ourselves and our closest relatives. And this gives us some insights, some clues about what the selective pressures were in regards to humans. So a human brain is not just 3 times bigger than that of a chimpanzee. It's got some very interesting specific differences in terms of things like receptors and where they're located for these affiliative neuropeptides. And they can function to facilitate very specialized kinds of behaviors, like the addiction I have as a father for my children. We share with chimpanzees the ability to form coalitionary bonds and to do things like go out and on border patrols and whatnot. but there are these other more specific differences. The key focus of my talk is going to be thinking about this social context in human evolutionary history and what it has to do with the practical problem, why we get sick. So I'm going to take this in a few stages. First off, why is it that we have a physiological response to our social environments? Why is there developmental sensitivity to experiences during childhood such that these stress response systems, the physiology, is influenced by such experiences, particularly family relationships? And then the sort of evolutionary medicine take on this. How do we understand, I think in a different way than has traditionally been the case, how stress might be advantageous, adaptive? How has natural selection modified this system in ways that were beneficial for our ancestors? And that is a really different take on it, and I'll discuss some more theoretical background to that in just a bit. But first, by way of giving you a little primer here, Calvin is stressed out. Hobbes has surprised him, and the classical thought about stress response is, okay, what does Calvin need to do? He's got to amp it up. He needs to crank up his heart rate. He's got to dump some energetic resources so that he can get away from this emergency, right? And the hero in my story is this particular outcome of that kind of response. It's a glucocorticoid hormone, cortisol. It's a very friendly fellow for field research because it has a relatively small molecular weight, which means that it can easily filter through tissues, in this case into saliva. And a lot of my research involves collecting saliva and monitoring levels of this hormone. And it's great for a stress study because you're not, for example, chasing kids around with syringes, which would obviously have problems for your study design. So the general approach here to thinking about stress response is that the physiological changes that ensue allow for managing resources. So you can allocate resources to the places and the timing where they're most needed. And that's an easy story when you're trying to get away from a predator. It's a more difficult story when we're talking about psychosocial stress. And that's really where the big debates have been taking place, is engaging this physiological stress response, in particular the HPA system that results in the production of cortisol. Was that be designed by natural selection? Are there positive adaptive outcomes from engaging that system in response to psychosocial stimuli? And it's a hard question. And I think evolutionary medicine provides some very important new perspectives on that question. And just by way of review, here's a quick schema for the way this system has been perceived. So at the top, we've got some external stimuli, a stressor. It's perceived by your central nervous system. And if it's perceived a certain way, it's going to then stimulate this hormonal cascade, starting with the hypothalamus and the release of corticotropin-releasing hormone, which will then pass down to the pituitary, which is going to release ACTH. That will then flow into the plasma down to your adrenals, which will then stimulate the release of this cortisol. And there are good explanations for how this system evolved in mammals and why it's been maintained. But the psychosocial stuff, and in particular early trauma, has got some tweaks on it. This system, like many physiological systems, has a negative feedback loop, so that when you release cortisol into your system, it's eventually going to work its way back up to your brain, and when it does so, it's going to shut down the production of further cortisol. So it's like a thermostat that turns on the furnace. It elevates the temperature. That elevated temperature then feeds back to the thermostat, which shuts off the furnace. So everything works fine as long as the system is not perturbed. One of the hypotheses about psychosocial stress, and particularly excessive psychosocial stress, is that this can be toxic to the feedback system. So cortisol does a lot of different things. It can catabolize neurons, and as a consequence, it can, in effect, break the thermostat. So one of the arguments, we're going to be looking at things that in normal everyday environments stimulate stress response. We're all going to also look at developmental sequences. And one of the arguments about why stress early on is particularly damaging, so early family environment, particularly important, can be particularly damaging, is because if you are exposed to high levels of stress early on, it's breaking your thermostat, and you're then, throughout your lifetime, likely to have levels of cortisol that are not going to be advantageous. So, and there's a fair bit of experimental and other evidence in support of this idea. So looking at rodent models where you remove pups from their mothers or interfere with the grooming that they normally get, and then we look at those pups when they're grown-up adults. We see that when we expose them to a stressor that we have higher than normal levels of cortisol being produced. Same thing with a primate model with macaques. And when we look at humans, the evidence is a little more mixed, but we don't want to be doing experimental manipulations to stress infants or the fetus, obviously, but looking at comparisons between individuals that had those kinds of conditions and how they then respond to stressors as adults. They tend to have different patterns of cortisol response than individuals who weren't exposed to those kinds of things. So based on this evidence, developmental evidence, a model's been built up. Basically, if you have a lot of stress early on, you damage those receptors, you break the thermostat. The glucocorticoid receptors in the hippocampus are no longer going to be turning off that cascade. So the HPA system is dysregulated. It's not going up and down appropriately or adaptively. And because cortisol is doing a whole bunch of things, including modifying certain aspects of immune function, this is going to interfere with your ability to deal with pathogens and infectious diseases of various sorts. So you're sick more often. This has been the most widely accepted model, I think, for linkages between stress, and particularly early stress, as developmental consequences throughout the lifetime. Robert Sapolsky, a brilliant neurobiologist who's been very interested in stress, frames it this way, that as he sees it, purely psychological stressors, one that doesn't require running away or some kind of physical response to this stimulus, it's a mistake. You shouldn't elevate your cortisol levels. It's just an incidental byproduct of the whole stress system. Stress is stress is stress, whether it's psychosocial stress or a physical stressor, and sometimes that system doesn't work right, in particular in the case of responding to psychological stressors. There are two other models here that I'd like to propose, and then we're going to quickly turn to the field, and the rest of the talk will be data-driven to try and tease out what we can in regards to which of these models is best supported by evidence. Gerald Huther, who's a neurobiologist in Germany, suggested that cortisol is very important in its role to allow for remodeling of neural connections. So when you get stressed, one of the things you're going to need to do is to be able to adapt, to change your understanding of what's going on in your environment. To do that, you're going to have to break some eggs to make an omelet. So his argument is that stress response facilitates destabilizing some connections, particularly those that, if we can target the ones that aren't working right, that then allow for reorganization and the development of a more adaptive model for dealing with our social environments. That kind of fits in part. I mean, there are other ways in which stress response could be perceived as adaptive, response to psychosocial stress. Randy and colleagues have, I think, done the most elegant explanation of how stress response could be adaptive as they see it, and they make some very precise and refined discussion of this. The stress system is a complex, sophisticated, and carefully regulated adaptation that has been shaped by natural selection because it gives a selective advantage. A nice evolutionary medicine hypothesis. And how do we know? How do we go after this? And stress research has really been hampered because a lot of these ideas could best be looked at if one has got a longitudinal study that allows one to follow individuals through time so that you can not only see what kinds of things they respond to in their environments and how that affects their cortisol responses, but what the developmental consequences are as well. So this has been the please, why can't we do this? And, the answer to that with humans is, you're asking for such a difficult circumstance. Who would ever, track cortisol levels for years and years and years to see how that works out? And, my answer to that is, find me an anthropologist. Some of them do this kind of stuff. And so for the last 25 or so years, I've been trying to do what the stress researchers have been asking to have done. I've been working in a rural community on the island of Dominica. This is a view out my office window. I've been very impressed touring the ASU campus at some of the views you all have of Saddleback Mountain and whatnot, and now I see why you get such great work done. So this is the view out my window, and this is what I've been doing. I've been there quite a while now, and most of what we do is not experimental or manipulative. It's naturalistic. We're just looking at these kids in their everyday lives. So we don't want to influence them in any way whatsoever. We want them to be doing what they would just normally be doing. And we've been looking at all the kids in that community, and we've been doing lots of great anthropological stuff in terms of mapping out kin networks and figuring out where people live and monitoring their family environments through time and generally being members of the community. So over the past 25 years, I've lived in the community more than 5 years. So it's a second home for me. We have a lot of medical data. We monitor the children's health very closely. So as I'm speaking to you here, I have a research assistant that goes around and checks all the kids twice a week. And that's been going on now for 25 years. So we know when those kids are sick and when they're not sick and other things that are going on in their everyday lives. We measure their growth twice a year, every which way but Friday, both sides, so we know about symmetry and all kinds of stuff like that. We've got some immune markers, although that stuff is pretty problematic. And we're now starting to get into some genetic research, which I am extremely excited about. Just the fact that an anthropologist like myself can even think about doing research on genetics is yeah, I mean, you know, the political barriers to that in anthropology were just amazing. I'm also, you know, I'm an anthropologist, but I'm also kind of a psychologist, a developmental psychologist, and so we've been looking at a lot of different psychological aspects of these kids, because obviously that's just part and parcel of all this, very critical. Randy thinks it's impressive that I've collected over 32,000 saliva samples, and, you know, I guess that's a lot of spit, so. As we do this, we are tracking kids in their everyday lives. So this girl is sweeping the living room, and we'll subsequently have her give us a little saliva sample. These boys are down in the ocean, and they're going to be playing King of the Hill on that rock out there, which is pretty interesting. Pretty interesting to see how that affects their androgen levels, like testosterone as well. They're taking care of their little siblings. They're helping their parents garden. When I started there 25, 26 years ago, there was no electricity, no running water, and the vast majority of food that was consumed was grown or collected by people there. There wasn't much stuff going in or out. That has changed a lot. They make their own toys. This particular scooter is embedded in my memory because it was part of a high cortisol event in which I was walking up a very narrow path, and the older kid here and his older brother, not his younger brother who he's got on here, were coming down that path at about 25 miles an hour, and I had nowhere to go except off a cliff with my saliva samples, which were not harmed. I do these loops, visiting all the different households, checking up on the kids, collecting saliva. I do this hour after hour, day after day, week after week, month after month, year after year. And this accumulates in a lot of freezers. You know, as we're doing this, we have to get a lot of information with each saliva sample. So obviously we've got to have a numeric tag on it. We got to know who it's coming from. We got to know when we collected it. We have to know when that child woke up, because there's significant circadian profiles to some of the hormones we're looking at. And we want to know what's going on in their lives. So this was a randomly chosen thing. Just to give you a sense of how this stuff maps out over time. I apologize for how that got garbled in this particular monitor. But I think you get the gist of it, that you follow a kid through time and look at the kinds of things that are going on in their hormone levels. This is a cortisol Z-score on this axis, and this is starting 1990 and ending up in 2010 there. Really, really important component of the research is talking to the kids, being really comfortable, really intimate, so that you get a really deep picture of what's going on in their lives and how they respond to it. How do they feel about it? And so those two little girls are the same two little girls, and actually their mother I interviewed on the same doorstep years before. If we look at sort of very general, the big picture of what kinds of things in their lives result in elevated cortisol levels, the vast majority of it is social family type stuff. And now we want to look downstream at what those elevated cortisol events do to kids. Some more comparisons. Here we're looking at half-siblings in the same household, some of whom have got both mom and dad as their genetic parent, and some of whom have got genetic mom but a stepfather. And in general, the kids that are living with the stepfather have higher cortisol levels than do their half-siblings. They also have higher morbidity levels. Now, there could be a lot of reasons for this, not necessarily the elevated cortisol, so we really need to tease out what the dynamic is here between stressful events, physiological response, and downstream morbidity. And we want to figure out how this works in child development. We're going to look at some big traumatic events, and there's a lot of possibilities here. Like most communities, they got stuff going on. They get hurricanes, landslides, political revolutions, sort of what happens to the community that's affecting everybody there, albeit in somewhat individually specific ways. There are stressful events that are occurring at the family level. So grandma might die, might be an abusive incident, and then there are going to be child-specific trauma. And when we look at all these things, it turns out that if we look at cortisol profiles in regards to hurricanes and political revolutions, I just can't find anything in terms of downstream effects on their cortisol response. So if you were 2 years old when a hurricane hit, and we look then 10 years later at your cortisol response to see if it's different than someone else who didn't experience that hurricane because they hadn't been born yet, no difference. So hurricanes, political revolutions, those community-wide events, I can't see any. I've looked, can't find anything. If we look at the family level stuff in terms of deaths, separations, divorces, abusive relationships, that's where you see it. That's where you get significant acute elevations of cortisol, and as we'll see, some developmental effects. If we follow these kids looking at their cortisol profiles, a lot of kids look like this. So, these are year-by-year accumulations. And what you're seeing is that in the case of this particular child, and about 40% of the kids in my sample, you get a picture like this, longitudinally, where there's not a whole lot of change in their average cortisol levels or even the variability in the cortisol levels from year to year to year. Slightly larger number of kids who've got a profile like this, which is, they're pretty stable, but every once in a while they seem to have a stressful year, at least in terms of elevated cortisol levels. And remember, one of the hypotheses we're going to investigate here is whether or not early trauma is damaging the thermostat, the receptors, the glucocorticoid receptors, then resulting in permanent downstream effects on these cortisol profiles. And what we would predict is kids that do have early traumatic events are then going to have lifelong changes to their cortisol profiles, resulting in something like this, where we have a kid who had reasonably moderate cortisol levels and then a known stressor of significant nature, and then that's it. After that, boom, you're hypercortisolemic, and the consequences for this in terms of your health could be very dramatic. So do we see this? And the answer is I cannot, all the cases I've got, and there aren't a lot of them, so we're dealing with a fairly small sample size, in which we get a profile like this, in which we seem to have a fairly permanent elevation of cortisol levels. In every case, we can't tease apart the hypothesis that it was damage to the glucocorticoid receptors from the explanation that we have continued high stress in this child's environment, which is causing them to continue to have elevated cortisol levels. So we can't distinguish between those two hypotheses easily. All of the kids who have that kind of profile have a persistent stressful environment. So that cell over there in the far right is the one that we're especially interested in. So the kids with a major change The ones that keep a major change still have continuing stressors in their environment. That would explain why their cort levels are elevated. If we look at early trauma and elevated cortisol levels, and here we're going to look at kids that are 10 years old, and there seems to be a pretty good linkage here between if you had a high stress thing when you were an infant and then your subsequent cortisol levels when you're 10 years of age. Again, that would be consistent with the damaged glucocorticoid receptor hypothesis, but there could be other explanations as well that we're going to want to try and tease out. Morbidity follows a similar pattern, but the links between elevated cortisol and morbidity here are not clearly mapped out for us. I've tried to look at some immune markers that might give us some intermediate mechanisms for the linkages between cortisol and morbidity. In this case, a relationship between secretory IgA, in which kids that have higher morbidity tend to have lower levels of this particular biomarker. But I'm very dubious of its real causality here. We've looked at some other ones that show somewhat similar relationships, but there's a lot of other explanations for why we might be getting these kinds of patterns that don't necessarily indicate that cortisol is directly involved in what's going on with those particular immune markers that we're looking at. If I had to show you a single slide today, this is probably it. It's not a pretty slide, but the data in it, for me at least, are really remarkable. And what you're seeing is the effect of an acute stressful event. So the yellow bars are individuals who did not have a stressful event, and the orange bars were following individuals who had a stressful event at that time zero, and then we're looking at their morbidity levels in subsequent days. And what you're seeing is that kids get sick 2.5 times more often following the week following a high stress event. I don't know of any other risk factor with that significant a result. What we're looking at are primarily upper respiratory tract infections, common colds, rhinoviruses. About 9-10% of it is diarrheal type stuff, but we're not talking serious illnesses. These are just typical kinds of stuff. Whether you get sick or not is hugely influenced by whether or not you had a high stress event in a few days prior. There's some other data that also are a bit perplexing. For example, children with more social connections, more physical contacts per day with other children. You would guess from an epidemiological model that the more kids you're touching, the more risk you have for transmission of a pathogen that's then going to make you sick. And so there should be a positive relationship between the number of social contacts you have and your morbidity. It's exactly the opposite. The kids that have more social contacts have lower morbidity. There's a couple different ways we might approach that, but one potential explanation is that, if you will, more popular kids, more socially secure kids that have got more support, and these are kids that have moderate cortisol levels, not low cortisol levels, they're moderate. They're elevating cortisol in response to social stimuli. They're aroused, it's exciting, they're fun. They tend to be healthier. So what I now want to turn to is trying to figure out ways that we can tease apart some of these hypotheses. And one of the ways in which we can do so is by looking at different sources of stress. So this girl is walking the goat up the mountain, and that physical exertion will elevate her cortisol levels typically by about 50%, sometimes 100%. She's mobilizing the resources that she needs, her muscles need, to walk up that hill. So here's an example of, I think it was a 11, 12-year-old boy who was carrying about 60 pounds of wood. That's a pretty heavy load for a small kid weighing, roughly 25, 30 kilos. He's carrying his own weight, in effect, in wood, and he's carrying it for several kilometers on very difficult terrain. And those nice red dots are the cortisol response to that physical exertion. And that's very typical. The other pattern that you're seeing here is the circadian profile of cortisol. So it's highest about a half an hour after you wake up. And then it, you guys are good with this. And then it slowly works down to a nadir after you've gone to sleep, which makes sense. So, it's a hormone that's releasing energy that you need to do the kinds of things you do during the day. And when you're not doing them at night, it's way damped down and allows other kinds of activities to take priorities. So I'm going to show you a series of 3 slides here that are teasing apart some different responses to acute stressful events and subsequent morbidity levels. That slide I showed you previously, this one, showing you the almost 3-fold increase in morbidity following a high-stress event. Here we're looking at a psychosocial stressor that is accompanied by a more than 2 standard deviation rise in cortisol. And that's the morbidity result. Here we're looking at when the stressor was a physical event, and we also have the elevation of cortisol. And we do not get the morbidity change, at least not a significant one. And if we look at a social stress event observed, reported, where we don't get that really dramatic, extreme elevation of cortisol, more than 2 standard deviations. It could be 1 standard deviation or nothing or -1. And morbidity levels. The pattern is not nearly as strong, but there are some significant differences in 3, 4, and 5, 6 days following a stressful event. And then finally, looking at just elevation of cortisol without any reported physical event or a stressful social event and morbidity levels, there's what would appear to be, a slight elevation, but it's not significant in terms of morbidity. So it's really that combination of a psychosocial event that's accompanied by the high physiological response that is associated with the elevated morbidity levels. So then, if you can remember back to that cascading model, going from exposure to a stressor to ill health, and looking at some of the connections that we've been able to make in this research effort. Kids with early trauma do tend to have higher cortisol subsequently in childhood and early adulthood. Our links between early trauma and immune function are a little more difficult to track. I'm not very confident in those, but there is good evidence that kids with early trauma do have higher morbidity levels subsequently. Some links possibly between cortisol and immune response that we've been able to look at. Certainly good relationships between cortisol and morbidity, although they require observed psychosocial stressors as a cofactor. So, some of these things are working out pretty well. In regards to the damaged glucocorticoid receptor hypothesis, we're in trouble because we don't really have the kind of data we need, which is really a brain scan that can look at the receptors or some more direct measure of their efficacy. And I don't have that. Don't have that at all. But I think there's one other way that we can look at to test that hypothesis. So going back again to our little girl climbing up the hill and elevating her cortisol in response to that, if she were an early trauma child with damaged glucocorticoid receptors, what would we expect to see downstream from her elevated cortisol level in the hours following that? We'd expect to see a different half-life than a child that had the intact, non-damaged glucocorticoid receptors. So taking all the cases I had in which we had an elevated cortisol level in response to a physical event, and we're going to compare these to psychosocial events, we see this. The kids that underwent early traumatic events have no difference in the rate of recovery from an elevation of their cortisol levels in response to a physical event. I don't see the damaged glucocorticoid receptors there. They seem to be working just fine, thank you very much, when the stressor is a physical one. On the other hand, when the stressor is a social one, that's where we see the difference emerge. And I'm speculating that a lot of what's involved here in terms of the differences in responses to the kids that have undergone early trauma involve, in effect, different models of their social worlds that are more stressful for them than the kids who had not undergone early trauma of that sort. A few other pieces of this puzzle that I'd like to present to you. I don't want you to walk away thinking that stress is just this bad thing that you need to avoid. Stress, if it's an adaptive function, it's releasing resources that you need to meet demands. And some of those demands could be perceived as negative, like getting away from a predator or an abusive event. But we also elevate arousal and stuff in response to what would be perceived as positive stuff. And here what we're looking at are kids that I put into one of two groups, one of which these kids, there's nothing going on at Christmas for them. They're not going to get any presents. They're in families that don't really have the resources or the interest in providing anything for their kids at Christmas, versus those families in which Christmas is kind of a big deal and the kids have got high expectations. And if we look at the cortisol levels of these kids on Christmas Eve, really in the days leading up to Christmas, we see a flip-flop in terms of who's got the high cortisol levels. So the kids with the low expectations at non-Christmas season have higher cortisol levels than the kids who've got high expectations. But when Christmas rolls around, the kids that are really excited about Christmas, they've got elevated cortisol levels. There's lots of other stuff that I could throw at you. Your cortisol levels go up when you have sex, so presumably most of us don't perceive that as a negative event. That makes a lot more sense in terms of this being a refined, evolved system that provides resources when they're needed. Another thing in regards to the bigger picture of the family environment and support for the child and involves alloparents, grandparents, aunties, siblings. And if we look at the effect of family environments that have got lots of helpful, largely grandparents in this case, those kids that underwent early traumatic events have got cortisol profiles that are indistinguishable from the kids that didn't have any early trauma. So there's something going on here in how these kids respond to their family environments when they've got this bigger, more supportive group than when they don't. The kids that have got to be figuring stuff out for themselves, that don't have that insurance policy, they're the ones that we're seeing the high cortisol levels, particularly in response to stuff that is probably not in their best interests to have to be aroused for. Okay, so an overall model for this kind of thing. We saw previously that cascade from early trauma leading to poor health with the damage to the hippocampus resulting in dysregulation of the cortisol release, resulting in diminished immune function. I think my research supports some other intervening possibilities here in terms of what's going on, that the linkage between cortisol involves some changes in neural structures, long-term potentiation, perhaps pruning, even synaptogenesis, that are involved in the child developing these effective social models that allow them to be comfortable in their social environments. Social incompetence, depression, low family support is what's pushing a lot of these elevated cortisol levels that then downstream can result in higher morbidity levels. So security in the family is a big deal. A couple other quick pieces of data here. Something else we can look at is not just individuals in isolation, but synchrony in hormone levels. So here what we're going to look at are mother-infant pairs, and we're going to be looking at saliva in mother, saliva in infant, and breast milk from the mother and the cortisol levels therein. And looking at whether or not when mom goes up, infant goes up, and it's hard to tell who's driving who. We can't. We can try and get at it looking at lags, but it's really a very difficult thing to do, particularly with small sample sizes. Some mother-infant pairs look like this, in which mother and infant in all three solutions that we're looking at, they're tracking each other. They're in synchrony. Other mother-infant pairs are like, no correlation at all, sometimes even slightly negative correlations. So we're then going to look at these mother-infant pairs downstream to see what's going on with them. We're really open to exploring all kinds of different ways to try and figure out child outcomes. Early on, one of the techniques I used was using the Denver developmental test. And here you look to see if kids are doing age-appropriate kinds of things in terms of, can they stack blocks, a whole variety of physical and mental tasks. And if they can't, you tally up what's called a risk factor. Big difference here in terms of looking at these synchronous mother-infant pairs. They don't have risk factors. Whereas the level of synchrony in the infants that did have one or more of these risk factors was much lower than those that were synchronous. If we look at attachment, and this involved a complex composite of observations of mother-infant interactions, shared gaze, physical contact, assessments of others in terms of the warmth of the relationship. And here there's a pretty dramatic difference in that the mothers from this category of close, intense, secure attachment tend to have much more synchronous cortisol levels. And part of this is going to be those mothers and infants that can afford the luxury of doing stuff together, and they're just experiencing the same kinds of things together that is then liable to be provoking them to have these same cortisol levels. But there are some cases that suggest to us that it's more than just that. It's more than just mothers and infants being together and doing things together, in some cases more than other mother-infant pairs. Depressed moms tend to be much less in sync with their infants. So there's also something interesting going on there. So if I can summarize these results for you in terms of what we've seen with cortisol, kids with early traumatic experiences have unusual cortisol levels. They get sick more often. So, it's important. It's important not just in terms of the psychological aspects for these children, but their downstream real life, getting sick or not, and how long are you sick, consequences of this. And of all the things I can measure in this environment for these children, why do they get sick? The primary thing is their social environment. Recovery from physical stressors is not linked to whether or not you had an early traumatic experience. This suggests that the HPA dysregulation is involving the CNS cognitive processes, emotional processes, not the glucocorticoid receptors in the hippocampus. So it's not the broken thermostat model that seems to be explaining this. Allo parents are great. Grandparents, I recommend them. And here we are, Phoenix, Tempe. I see a lot of grandparents. Coming into that airport, I must have seen at least half a dozen reunions where a young couple was bringing their kids, and there were the grandparents. And it was all I could do not to say, please, saliva samples. Welcome to Phoenix. And there's cool stuff to look at besides cortisol, these affiliative neuropeptides. What are the evolved systems for grandparental attachment? This is a very unusual adaptation we humans have got with our multi-generational systems of investment. We don't know what the mechanisms are. I mean, that should surely have some traction with some potential donors here. Explain the evolution of grandparenting and why it is that you love those grandkids, and how it's similar and how it's different. I mean, we've collected a lot of urine samples now. Oxytocin is a far more difficult chemical to assay than is cortisol, but it's hard. I mean, you got to get a lot of grandparents, a lot of interactions with the grandkids, and a lot of controls and whatnot to start to track down this stuff, and then try and figure out how it's similar and how it's different from the maternal and paternal systems. But hopefully at some point we'll get there. Okay, so yeah, stepkids and other kids in difficult family environments. There's a lot of stuff going on there, and a lot of things we can do. Grandparents, really important. Stress, don't walk away thinking it's negative. It's this beautiful adaptation that allows you to respond to your environments in ways that are really important for you, be it negative kinds of stimuli, if you will, or positive ones. There's, we think, some cool stuff going on in terms of synchrony. And, we looked at mother-infants. We're now looking at siblings, older parent-offspring, and peer relationships to see what might be going on there and how that correlates with different networks. The big picture stuff to take away from this is that, we are a very special, unique species. We've got a unique evolved suite of behavioral adaptations for sociality, and these hormonal systems that we're looking at can provide some interesting clues as to how they evolved and what their functions are. And I think there's all kinds of cool stuff that we could be doing in a translational evolutionary medicine, thinking about these kinds of systems, how they evolved and what the consequences of them are in terms of effective public health and integrating the social behavioral sciences with the life sciences and medical sciences. I just think there's tremendous potential there. And I'm having a blast doing this. Somebody asked me whether or not I liked my job the other day, someone serving coffee. And, my response was, hell yes. I've got the best job in the world. And, part of that is it just doesn't stop. It's like the more you get, the more there is to do. So there are all kinds of interesting things we can be looking at with hormones, androgen profiles, testosterone, DHEA, adrenarchy, all kinds of cool stuff with humans that we have not figured out yet in terms of their evolved functions and what it's up to. I don't think I'll ever get away from cortisol and trying to figure out how to better analyze profiles as opposed to sort of the crude analysis of average levels, be it waking up cortisol, that stuff, it's not very rich. As an anthropologist who's spent 25 years doing this kind of stuff, way back 25 years ago, you do an electronic search on, salivary cortisol, and there weren't very many people doing it. We really were among the first folks to get started in this, and certainly the folks doing it longitudinally in a naturalistic context. But it has just absolutely exploded. You know, I get asked to review probably a dozen papers a month where some exposure to some stimulus and then a cortisol outcome. And I get frustrated. It's like, that's cool. I like this. It's worth publishing. But, you know, the generalizations that people are trying to do from, you know, a few samples of cortisol, I'm not very comfortable with it. But I can't distinguish that from the hypothesis that I've got this vested interest. And, of course, you can't do anything right if you haven't gotten 25 years of this kind of stuff. So, the affiliative hormones, I think, are just, you know, I've been waiting and waiting and waiting to be able to get an assay where we can really monitor these things effectively, because they are so cool in terms of what they're doing. The problem is, you know, looking at them in saliva or even in serum, it's so crude. You really want to know where they're binding, what receptors they're bound to figure that out. Immune profiles, I want some better systems there, and genomics is going to be such the holy grail, because so much of the individual variability in these behaviors, which grandparents are really sucked in and potentially addictive to those grand offspring, which ones not so much. I think there's a lot of genetic explanation behind that, and you know, a lot of it's going to be GE interaction, but we've been without G for so long, and there's just so much cool stuff to be looking at there. Cross-cultural comparisons, how do human societies differ in this stuff? You know, we are not a monomorphic species. Tremendous flexibility and influence of culture on these kinds of things. And we'd also love to be able to compare ourselves with our primate cousins to see what the evolved differences are, and then ideally track the genetic differences that are responsible for that. Wow, we'll know so much more about those kinds of things. I've got a million people to thank, but by and large, they're colleagues and a fabulous group of graduate students, med students, that have been willing to come down to the research site in Dominica, and I'm really encouraging. So if there's any of you that want to collaborate with me, remember that view out the office window? It doesn't work so well here. Maybe like summertime. Arguably, that Dominica environment could be appealing to you as opposed to 120 degrees on the concrete. So thank you all so much for your attention and interest.
Microphone so that people at distant sites can hear what we're saying. We have time for just a few questions before we move on.
Yeah.
Okay, so I'm very interested in different individuals' adaptive responses to stress, and one way that you could look at it with your samples would have been to look at the people who, all the children who were exposed to trauma, and then those who had high stress responses or cortisol levels compared to those who didn't, and look at if there's some different strategies. I know if you look at brain imaging, for instance, and you are looking at white matter tracts, people who are exposed to the same trauma, those who don't have post-traumatic stress disorder have greater connections between the hippocampus and the prefrontal cortex. So I think that's kind of an interesting thing, different strategies to look at what are the intrapersonal and perhaps social factors that are allowing certain individuals to adapt better in response to the stress.
Yeah, fantastic question, and I would sort of throw that back. So wouldn't it be fun to see if the kids who underwent early trauma but then had resilient outcomes in terms of morbidity and cortisol, they're the kids that have the high alloparental investment in them. If one of the effects of that high alloparental care is facilitating the kinds of neurobiological changes that result in the white matter. So the resiliency is coming about as a consequence not of a genetic difference or some physical difference, but the influence of the social environment on that child's neurobiological development. Just a lot of different ways we want to be looking at that stuff. My guess is it's going to be a very complex answer. So some individuals are going to be more sensitive, and that resiliency is going to come about in different ways. But yeah, won't it be fun to know those relationships?
I'm interested in your 25 years of growth tracking, and I suppose you have it for multiple generations, parents and children and all, and then the association with the cortisol levels and early trauma. So what effects have you seen on obesity among children that have experienced early trauma and their cortisol levels?
Yeah, I'm very interested in metabolic disorders, and the people in the village are very interested in metabolic disorders. Initially, that's just all about diabetes. Obesity is not really an issue when you live in this kind of environment. You're growing your own food, you're catching fish, you don't have fats, you're just eating relatively high fiber, low calorie kinds of things, and your level of physical exertion is astonishing. And you're that way from a very early age. But over the last 25 years, a lot of things have changed. So we now have a sort of paved road to the village. You don't have to ride a mule in. There's electricity. There's videos. There are cell phones. We have piped water. You get Delmarva frozen chicken. You can buy a bottle of oil. And now we're getting obesity. Surprise, surprise. But certainly some individuals are more susceptible to that kind of thing than others. The kinds of statistical analyses that I think are needed to tease out the changes that occur, pardon me, sort of globally from the 1980s to the 1990s, 2000s, 2010s, how you then factor that into the developmental sequences of individual children is complicated. We're now just starting to look at what the cortisol profiles are of kids that are more prone to obesity. So
I would also like to look at the generational and the apparent stature and the appearance cortisol levels and how that tracks through the generations, because I think there is the effect of the morphology and the genetics as well as the environment, of course.
Yep, and both of them are potentially heritable. I mean, you've got a whole cultural system that's being passed down, family, that influences all of these things. I mean, for humans to try and separate culture from, these other sort of physical things is, we can't do it. Culture is part of our evolved biology, and we're very sensitive to it. These are super questions, and I really like to think that this database will help us answer those kinds of questions. And that first step that we're taking with genetics involves looking at metabolic disorders and linkages with obesity and growth, primarily because that's what the people in the community want. That's what they're interested in. They're really curious why it is that people with African ancestry and European ancestry are prone to diabetes. People with more Carib, Native American ancestry are not, but they're much more prone to tuberculosis.
So we need to move to our next speaker, but I'm going to allow myself a brief question and then two more questions, and then we'll move on. My question is just first an observation. I think it's astounding that an anthropologist working on social stress and the like has demonstrated a stronger explanatory factor on rates of infection even than contact with the pathogen, even than almost anything else anybody has seen. And he hasn't emphasized it enough, but this is extremely powerful stuff, assuming it holds up with other people's studies in trying to figure, and it also doesn't make any sense to me, evolutionarily, posing a puzzle of the classic kind that leads to advances. Why should it be that not physical stress, but only social stress causes increased risks of infection a few days later? Do you have any speculations about that, or what further studies you could do to answer the question about what's going on here?
I wouldn't be quite so decisive in saying that physical stress doesn't influence downstream morbidity, because we do see some small, moderate effects of that. But I don't. And, I think what we need are a lot more data on the cortisol levels and what it's doing with the immune system to get a better sense of.
Lots more research. Steve, a question for you and Joan, and then we'll move to our next speaker.
In the interest of time, I'll pass. I'll talk to you later.
So
I guess I want all my friends to get along. So I'm trying to figure out how the sort of quote from Sapolsky that you put up, that perspective and your perspective might be integrated. And it seems to me that
Boy, you do want your friends to get along, don't you? That's a hard one, man. That's a bit oil and water.
But isn't it just kind of perspective that there are benefits and costs of these strategies, that he's emphasizing the costs because there are these sort of pathological implications of sustained higher cortisol levels, but you're emphasizing that this may be still, despite those costs, an adaptive way to build the system because, what's the alternative? I mean, that there are those costs, and
Yeah.
organisms bear those costs, but this is part of an evolved strategy that is overall net benefit under certain environmental circumstances.
Yep, the trade-offs.
So isn't
work.
that?
Yeah,
Aren't those all part of the same
Oh, gosh,
story?
Bob and I can easily drink a beer together and get along
Yeah, exactly.
very well. Absolutely.
Exactly.
So, I will say, sort of as a concluder here, that it's really wonderful to come place like Arizona State, where the questions you get not only clarify points that you might not have been so clear on in your talk, so thank you guys, but also bring up just great new stuff. So it is such a delight to come here and give a talk. And
we are really at the cutting edge here. I should say, Joan, that when I had Bob Sapolsky out to Michigan to talk about all this, I told him what I wanted him to talk about. I said, Bob, I want you to give an entire talk about what's good about the stress response. And he did. But he also mentioned that nobody pays you to study that. So, Mark, thank you very much. Appreciate it.
yeah, thank you all.